think that new food experiences are generating more waste. I think that really depends on the experience. There are quite a few examples of food experiences that we've seen that also integrate sustainability and are actually more low waste. So one good example of that is food experiences where the tableware or even the packaging is also edible. So even though that isn't a literal experience wherein, you know, you're at a restaurant and you're dining and there's like music or, you know, gamified packaging, it's still an experience that's new to people because they're eating their forks and their knives and their plates. So there's a way to provide this sense of adventure and experience that can in fact be low waste. To encourage consumers to share images of produce on social media, there is one example that I think about, which is from a few years back in Japan. What they were doing in this Japanese grocery store was a campaign put together by the local farmers where they actually made it so that when you touch a piece of produce, let's say a tomato, sensors then cue an audio message talking about the people who have farmed those tomatoes. So it was really cool and really interactive, and it was so simple. You know, the actual display at the grocery store looked like any other, so it was a surprise when people would go and reach for a tomato and the tomato would talk, and the tomato would say, oh, I was grown at this part of Japan, and the person who farmed me is named so-and-so. So there are experiences like that. I think another thing to do would be to not just pay attention to how beautiful the produce is and to make sure that it's aesthetically pleasing, but even if it looks a little odd, to lean into that. So there are a lot of photos online of produce that is weirdly shaped, right? Carrots that are like growing into each other and intertwining, or they look like little people. So that's another way to sort of encourage that. I think another thing to do could be to, in actual advertising and marketing, to put the produce front and center as well, maybe in a way that a consumer would photograph it and post it themselves. So sort of leading by example, I guess. Well, my personal thoughts on vegan and plant-based food is it's not for me, but I do think that vegan and plant-based foods, they're not going away anytime soon. I believe that the number of people who are interested in trying vegan and plant-based foods will only increase over time. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the number of people who will only eat vegan and plant-based food for the rest of their lives will increase over time. What we're seeing, and I think the Beyond Meat burger and the Impossible burgers, both of those cases prove this, is that even your average consumer, a person like myself who will never go full vegan, is curious about the vegan and plant-based offerings at the moment. So I think it is a good decision to dip your toe into vegan and plant-based. However, I don't think that it's absolutely integral to staying relevant. I think there will always be a demand for foods that are not vegan and plant-based as well. I think that's something that we're seeing more and more of. I think it was last year when McDonald's was trying to figure out how to stay relevant, and they landed on 24-hour breakfast here in North America, which I mean, I guess that makes sense, but to me, that proves that there is less interest in fast food. We're also seeing, as a response to that, these sort of fast casual eateries that are not as fast as we used to think fast casual would be. So there's sort of this new channel, in my opinion, in between those fast casual restaurants and those slow dining experiences that provide consumers with the opportunity to feel like they're eating something that is more authentic, because when we talk about slow eating, we're talking about authenticity, but also convenient. Another example of something that lives just in between those lines is the food kits. So like a HelloFresh, for example, there is still that element of convenience because it's delivered and the ingredients are curated and the recipe is given. However, what's slower than having consumers cook the food themselves? So I definitely think that there is more attention being paid to that slow eating movement and that sense of authenticity that applies to, you know, local ingredients and farm to table as well. Yes, yes, I'm glad that question was asked. So TikTok and actually YouTube has always been a huge place for the foodie movement. When we talk about why people want to bring their food experiences online, I think it's important to talk about Instagram as well, though, because it's the first social media site that was mostly visual. Facebook was about opinions and friendship and whatever. Instagram was about posting pretty photos. However, where we are today, it's true that those pretty food photos have evolved into food videos. So the food community on TikTok is interesting because it's different from YouTube. On YouTube, it's about learning how to cook and gaining new skills, even if you don't follow the instructions exactly. On TikTok, it's about very specific items and very specific tricks. And of course, reaching a new demographic. So whereas on YouTube, you see a lot of content that's more skewed toward the millennial generation, and specifically the sort of millennials over the age of 25, I'd say. On TikTok, it's more Gen Z, it's more the younger generation. So yeah, definitely those two platforms are growing in their relevance for foodies. In many ways. You know, it's a tough question to answer because we don't know how the food experience will change after the pandemic because it's not really over yet, unfortunately. Um, as I said earlier in the actual session, I do think that for one, when it comes to dining, if a consumer is going to a restaurant, it needs to be worth it and it needs to be safe. So there will be this huge focus on this balance between safety and experience, even more so than now. I do think that there will continue to be an increase, however, in consumers wanting to cook at home and wanting to learn new skills and wanting to try new and interesting ingredients. So I believe that during the pandemic and perhaps after the pandemic, it may be a really great time to be in CPG. It may be a really great time to be in grocery. Of course, as we're already seeing, there are a lot of sort of brands that are putting more emphasis on their delivery services. There are a lot of brands putting more emphasis on e-commerce, which I know is a big white space opportunity in Latin America. So I think that may be something to keep eyes on post-pandemic. You know, ironically, for today's consumer, if it looks like, if a campaign, let's say, or a product looks like it required less money to create, it seems more authentic. So the good news is that consumers are responding to sort of shabby chic, more sort of authentically made, even budget made content from brands because it looks like something they themselves could do. So I think a more tactical answer to this question that I can give is one way to convey authenticity with consumers that is very affordable is to crowdsource with them and have them do the work for you when it comes to marketing. I'm sure we're all familiar with the concept of holding contests on social media for your consumers to submit copy or artwork to be used in your advertisements. That's that you can do without an ad agency that's very affordable and also very authentic. Considering that the majority of consumers are encountering brand messages online and it's free to make content on the internet, that's a really easy way to be able to convey authenticity without spending a lot of money at all. So there are options, and in fact, it may work to your advantage that you don't want to spend money to seem authentic, because that's almost impossible. The more money, the more a company will try to manufacture authenticity, the less authentic it actually is. So complicated answer, I think, to a complicated question. What we're seeing on the website in terms of flavors that are becoming more popular over time is not necessarily dependent on a specific flavor profile as much as it's dependent on the psychology of it and how exotic a particular flavor may be. I will say that to be a little bit more specific, there's been a lot of interest in Korean flavors. A lot of that sort of Korean spice like gochujang and ingredients like that. We're seeing a lot of emphasis in general, actually, on Asian flavors. And I actually think that that's partially because foods in Asia and dishes in Asia are much more dependent on condiments than they are on specific produce, for example. And so that makes it an easier cuisine to learn how to cook and to be able to cook in the long run. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of Asian ingredients becoming more popular in that kind of flavor profile. However, in general, it's more dependent on what's exotic and easy to access as opposed to a specific flavor. The answer to that question really depends, I think, on honestly what's available to the consumer that we're talking about. And also, you know, the state of what happens in the world moving forward. We're in such volatile times at the moment. And, you know, processed foods to consumers may at this point represent something to be suspicious of, because there is this attitude where people want to eat more natural food. But the fact of the matter is that processed food tends to be more affordable and to have a longer shelf life. And given we're in this state of sort of economic uncertainty, I think that consumers will continue to desire more natural foods. And as I said earlier, just pronounceable ingredients. That doesn't necessarily have to mean expensive natural foods. It just means ingredients that are familiar to them. However, there may be a necessity down the line for consumers to kind of find that halfway point between processed foods and natural foods. So perhaps that's something to explore, how to provide that sort of happy medium of recognizable ingredients as well as ingredients in foods that are affordable and have a longer shelf life. Oh, that's a very good question. Currently, I do think that, and that question shocks me because I've never been asked that question before, but I've quite a bit. So yes, I would say that cannabis is currently a product or an ingredient, I guess, that is resonating more with the premium market. However, I will say that that's not necessarily because it's a status symbol or it's seen as a luxurious ingredient. I think that's simply because for today's consumer, being an insider and being an early adopter that is a sign of sort of premiumization, is a sign of status. So cannabis is currently still a premium ingredient simply because it's exclusive and it's rare and it communicates something about a person, that they're adventurous and that they're open-minded and that they're interesting for now. But I believe that it will eventually become more mainstream. Yeah, so I think that those two things don't need to be mutually exclusive. What people need doesn't need to be in, doesn't need to battle what they want. Sometimes they are the same thing. So with the example of food nutrition, that is actually something that consumers want more of nowadays. There is this call, I talked a lot in the presentation about consumers wanting to learn more about how to cook, but there is a huge set of consumers who want to learn more about what's healthy for them. And that's exemplified in, you know, the vegan and plant-based movements that we talked about earlier. So every once in a while, you know, those two things cross. What consumers need and what they want cross, especially consumers who are new parents, for example. especially consumers who have a lifestyle that's conducive to general wellness and health. However, that said, I don't necessarily think, even outside of nutrition and when it comes to food, I don't necessarily think that it's a good idea to choose to ignore the more frivolous wants of the consumer today. Because the thing about what consumers want in 2020 is that when one person wants it, they can talk about it and spread that message to large groups of people much faster than in the past. And so even though these fads don't last very long, they impact a lot of people very quickly. Yes, I definitely think that packaging has an impact on the modern foodie. Um, I think that if we take into consideration that this is a group that wants to learn more about their food, they want to experience things through their food, and they want a sense of authenticity and adventure, then that impacts a lot about the packaging. We're seeing consumers who are selecting packaging based on whether or not it simply looks more authentic. We're seeing consumers who are selecting packaging based on whether or not it includes a new recipe they can try. So definitely a lot of potential impact there, not just from an aesthetic standpoint, but also from a functional standpoint of packaging. I can't speak to exactly how much more consumers are willing to pay for more sustainable packaging, but I can say that statistics have shown us that in general, a large number of consumers are willing to spend more on products from all categories that align with their values. I think one thing to consider with that is that although the general population across the world is more aware of issues with sustainability and are more concerned with naturality, there is always also going to be a group of consumers who are die-hard eco-friendly. And so for them, you know, it's obvious that you can kind of count them out if you're not going to put energy and resources into more sustainable packaging. What I want to say overall is that statistics do say that consumers are willing to spend more on products that align with what they believe in. That doesn't necessarily mean that they do when they're thinking about convenience and they're thinking about what's easier to sort of access for them.